April 16, 1972, Than Hoa Bridge, North Vietnam. The sun hangs low over the Ma River, painting the twisted steel of the Than Hoa Bridge in amber light as North Vietnamese gunners scan the sky for the American strike package they know is coming. Then the roar arrives, not from high altitude where fighters typically approach, but from treetop level, barely 200 feet above the water. An A-7 Corsair II, painted in dark gray camouflage streaks beneath the bridge's span, pulls vertical and releases its bombs in a climb so steep it seems to defy gravity itself. Commander John Nichols holds the stick steady through the climb, feeling the aircraft shudder as 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs separate cleanly, then rolls inverted at the top of the loop, orienting himself for egress while anti-aircraft fire erupts in patterns where his aircraft should have been, but is not. North Vietnamese pilots scrambling to intercept find empty sky. The A-7 has already reversed course, is accelerating away at 500 knots just above the jungle canopy, too low for surface-to-air missiles to track effectively, too fast for the gunners to track manually. Two MiG-21 interceptors finally achieve visual contact, banking hard to pursue. Their pilots confident that their fighters, capable of Mach 2 and designed specifically for air superiority, will easily run down the subsonic American attack aircraft. Then the A-7 does something that North Vietnamese tactical doctrine says should be impossible. It turns inside them. Not gradually, not after bleeding speed, but immediately. Pulling so hard the airframe groans, reversing direction in a radius so tight the MiG pilots cannot follow without stalling. By the time they recover, establish their sight picture, and prepare to fire, the American aircraft has vanished again into the ground clutter, weaving through valleys at speeds and altitudes that make radar tracking impossible. The MiG pilots return to base, confused and frustrated, reporting an encounter that their instructors say could not have happened, that their Soviet advisors insist reflects pilot error rather than American capability. But the gun camera footage does not lie, and neither do the burning remains of the Than Hoa Bridge. To understand the shock that American A-7 operations inflicted on North Vietnamese fighter doctrine, one must first comprehend what Soviet aviation theory had promised about the nature of air combat. The MiG-21, North Vietnam's primary interceptor, embodied Soviet design philosophy. Speed above all else, minimal payload, lightweight construction, extreme performance in the vertical plane. The aircraft could accelerate to Mach 2, could climb to 50,000 feet in minutes, could intercept bombers before they reached their targets. American attack aircraft like the A-7 Corsair II were, according to Soviet tactical analysis, fundamentally vulnerable, subsonic, heavily loaded with weapons, designed for ground attack rather than air combat, flown by pilots trained in bombing rather than dog fighting. The conclusion seemed obvious. North Vietnamese interceptors would dominate any engagement, shooting down the slow American attackers with ease, forcing the United States to accept unacceptable losses or abandon their bombing campaigns. The first months of Operation Linebacker proved otherwise. The A-7 Corsair had entered service in 1967 as a replacement for the A-4 Skyhawk, designed specifically for the carrier-based attack mission. It was not fast. Maximum speed was barely 600 knots, less than half what a MiG-21 could achieve. It was not particularly nimble by fighter standards, with a larger wing loading than most air superiority aircraft, but it possessed capabilities that Soviet tactical theory had not accounted for, advantages that became apparent only when North Vietnamese pilots tried to shoot them down. The aircraft featured advanced aerodynamics that generated tremendous lift at low speeds, allowing sustained turns at G-forces that would stall conventional fighters. Its wing design created powerful vortices that maintained airflow over the control surfaces, even at extreme angles of attack, meaning the pilot retained control authority in situations where other aircraft would depart controlled flight. Most critically, it incorporated a heads-up display and sophisticated navigation computer that allowed the pilot to maintain situational awareness during violent maneuvering, to know exactly where he was and where threats were located, even while pulling maximum G in a hard turn. Lieutenant Commander Al Moyer, flying A-7s from USS America, would describe the aircraft's unexpected combat characteristics in after-action reports that circulated through Navy aviation communities. We were attacking heavily defended targets at altitudes where MiGs could intercept us easily. Soviet doctrine said we were easy kills, slow, loaded with bombs, unable to maneuver effectively. The first time a MiG-21 bounced me, I did what any attack pilot does. I turned into him as hard as the aircraft would turn. The A-7 pulled so hard, I grayed out at the edges of my vision. The MiG tried to follow and could not match my turn radius. He overshot, lost sight of me, and by the time he recovered, I was pointing at him with tone in my headset. I did not shoot. I was configured for ground attack, not air combat, but I could have. The MiG pilot broke off and ran. He had been taught American attack aircraft were helpless in air combat. His training had not prepared him for an aircraft that could outturn his fighter. The head-up display became a symbolic advantage that North Vietnamese pilots could not see, but whose effects they experienced repeatedly. In traditional air combat, pilots had to divide their attention between the world outside the cockpit and the instruments inside, looking down to check altitude, airspeed, heading, and weapons status. This head-down time created vulnerability, moments when situational awareness degraded and threats could maneuver unobserved. The A-7's HUD projected critical flight information onto a transparent screen directly in the pilot's line of sight, allowing continuous visual contact with the outside world while monitoring instruments. Soviet and North Vietnamese aircraft lacked this technology. Their pilots flew by feel and periodic instrument checks, estimating their energy state and position through experience and judgment. American A-7 pilots flew with complete information continuously available, knowing precisely their airspeed, altitude, and G-loading at every instant without looking away from the threat. This seemingly simple advantage transformed tactical decision-making. When a North Vietnamese pilot maneuvered aggressively, he had to estimate whether he had sufficient energy to complete the maneuver without stalling, had to judge by feel whether his airspeed was decaying dangerously. American pilots saw exact numbers, knew precisely their margins, could push to the edge of the performance envelope with confidence because the HUD told them exactly where that edge was. In engagements that were decided by fractions of a second and degrees of turn radius, this information advantage proved decisive. North Vietnamese pilots would report that American attack aircraft seemed to know exactly how hard they could maneuver, that they would pull to what appeared to be the stall limit and hold that condition indefinitely, never quite departing controlled flight, but extracting maximum performance from their airframes in ways that seemed almost prescient. The low-altitude operating environment where A-7s conducted most of their missions created additional challenges for North Vietnamese interceptors. MiG-21s were optimized for high-altitude interception, where their speed advantage was overwhelming and their light wing loading was not a handicap. At low altitude, in the thick air near sea level, their advantages diminished dramatically. High speed at low altitude consumed fuel at prodigious rates, limiting loiter time. Light wings that generated minimal drag at altitude became a liability in the dense air near the ground, where the MiG-21 could not pull high G without risking structural failure. The A-7, by contrast, was designed for low-altitude operations. Its heavier wing loading was optimal for the thick air where it operated. Its fuel capacity, vast by fighter standards, allowed extended time on station. Its structural strength permitted sustained high-G maneuvering that would tear the wings off a MiG-21 at similar altitudes and speeds. North Vietnamese pilot Nguyen Van Bay, who flew multiple engagements against American attack aircraft and survived the war, would describe in post-war interviews the frustration of trying to intercept A-7s operating in their element. Our tactics were based on high-speed passes, getting to the American aircraft quickly, shooting, and escaping before their fighters could respond. Against the A-7, this did not work. They flew so low our radar could not track them reliably. When we found them visually, they were always moving, jinking, changing altitude, and heading constantly. We would make our pass, and they would turn into us so sharply we could not follow. By the time we came around for another attempt, they had disappeared into the valleys or the weather. Our instructors told us the Americans were vulnerable. Our experience told us they were anything but. The transformation in North Vietnamese fighter tactics reflected their grudging acceptance that Soviet doctrine had not prepared them for what they actually faced. Initial intercept attempts followed standard procedures. Identify the target on radar, accelerate to high speed, approach from behind or above, fire missiles or guns, disengage before American fighters could respond. A-7 pilots countered by operating in regimes where this textbook approach failed. Terrain masking made radar detection difficult, low altitude negated the MiG's speed advantage, and aggressive defensive maneuvering defeated firing solutions. North Vietnamese pilots adapted by becoming more cautious, by abandoning the aggressive intercept tactics Soviet advisors recommended, by treating subsonic American attack aircraft with the same respect they gave supersonic fighters. This adaptation reflected a fundamental shift in understanding. The aircraft's maximum speed mattered less than its sustained maneuverability. Its radar signature was less important than its pilot's situational awareness, and technological sophistication could not compensate for tactical disadvantage. The symbolic power of the head-up display, that green projection of numbers and symbols that North Vietnamese pilots never saw, but whose effects they experienced constantly, became central to how American aviators understood their advantage. Before each mission, A-7 pilots would align and test their HUD, ensuring the symbology was crisp and accurate. That ritual, performed in ready rooms before launch, represented a connection to technology that provided a fundamental edge in combat. The HUD was not a weapon, not something that killed the enemy directly, but it enabled everything else. It allowed pilots to maneuver at the edge of their performance envelope with confidence. It maintained situational awareness during violent defensive maneuvers. It freed pilots to focus on tactics rather than instruments. North Vietnamese pilots flew with skill and courage, but they flew partially blind, estimating what American pilots knew with certainty. The loss ratios told a story that Soviet advisors struggled to explain. Despite flying subsonic attack aircraft, heavily loaded with bombs into the most heavily defended airspace in history, A-7 losses to enemy fighters were remarkably low. The aircraft proved more survivable in air combat than many dedicated fighters, not because it was faster or more agile in absolute terms, but because its pilots could extract maximum performance while maintaining awareness. North Vietnamese after-action reports, examined by American intelligence after the war, revealed consistent patterns. MiG pilots would identify A-7s as targets of opportunity, would maneuver to attack, and would find themselves unable to achieve firing solutions as the American aircraft turned inside their turn radius, maintained energy states that should have been impossible, and demonstrated awareness of threats that should have been in their blind spots. And so, we return to that moment over Than Hoa, to the vertical climb that North Vietnamese gunners did not anticipate, to the inverted roll that positioned the aircraft for egress before defenders could react, to the low-altitude escape that made radar tracking impossible, and visual tracking nearly so. The head-up display glows green in Commander Nichols's field of view, showing airspeed decreasing through the climb, altitude increasing through 10,000 feet, G-loading building toward the airframe limit. He knows exactly his energy state, knows precisely when to roll inverted, knows the instant to pull through and establish his egress heading. The MiG pilots, scrambling to intercept, see only an aircraft that should be vulnerable but is not, that should be slow but maneuvers like a fighter, that should be confused and defensive, but instead executes its mission with precision that suggests complete tactical awareness. They cannot see the HUD that provides that awareness, cannot understand the navigation computer that maintains orientation during violent maneuvering, cannot comprehend the philosophical difference between Soviet engineering that optimized for specific scenarios and American engineering that provided tools enabling pilots to create their own advantages. The head-up display that guided Nichols home, that maintained his situational awareness through the chaos of combat, represented more than technological innovation. It embodied a trust in human capability, a belief that providing information empowered better decisions, a philosophy that treated pilots as adaptable problem solvers rather than executors of predetermined tactics. North Vietnamese pilots flew with courage and determination, but their doctrine assumed specific scenarios and provided specific responses. American pilots flew with information that enabled adaptation, that allowed real-time assessment and decision-making, that freed them to exploit opportunities their enemies could not predict because they had not been scripted in advance. The difference was not merely technical but philosophical, not simply about better equipment, but about different beliefs regarding how warfare should be conducted, how technology should serve human judgment rather than replacing it, how information could transform vulnerability into advantage, even when flying subsonic aircraft into supersonic threats. The green glow of the HUD, invisible to enemies but central to American tactical success, told a story about competing visions of air warfare, about the power of awareness over speed, about the advantage of adaptable humans equipped with good information over rigid doctrine enforced through central control. And in the skies over North Vietnam, that story was written in the stunned confusion of enemy pilots who could not understand why their advantages had become irrelevant.